Ever since it was announced that USC and UCLA were joining the Big Ten starting with the 2024 season, a lot of people, including myself, kept the Big Ten expansion eyes on the West Coast. But really, our eyeballs should shift to the other side of the country in the Southeast. Because if the Big Ten is able to get into the Southeast part of the country, the chinks in the armor could start to show for the SEC. Before we get into the video, just a reminder to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Big Ten content all offseason long. Always crush that like button to spread the word of Big Ten Ted to the masses. Really, there's 4 schools, I believe, that make a dent. There's 4 schools that could really provide a big boost for the Big Ten financially, could provide a big boost for the Big Ten in their academics and research, and especially could provide a big boost for the Big Ten on the field with the ripe recruiting grounds in the Southeast. Because that's what this video is focused on. It's about on the field. Can the Big Ten surpass the SEC on the field if the Big Ten can go into these Southeast recruiting markets and get schools that already occupy these rich Southeast recruiting markets? The 4 schools I'm talking about: Florida State and Miami. When you talk about recruiting, you got to talk about the state of Florida. California, Texas, and Florida, those are the ripe recruiting grounds. Those are the 3 big states for high school football recruiting, where a lot of the really good and elite players come out of those 3 states. Miami, especially South Florida and Miami. When you talk about recruiting markets, DFW, Miami, and LA, that's as good as it gets in recruiting. Georgia Tech is an interesting one because Atlanta is a pretty Georgia Bulldogs heavy city. A lot of red and black in Atlanta, and of course, the Bulldogs are going to own that area in recruiting. Hell, they own the entire country in recruiting, it seems like, these days. But having the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets as a Big Ten pipeline to the area, I think would be beneficial for a lot of the other schools in the Big Ten, right? If you add Georgia Tech, all of a sudden, I don't think Georgia Tech's going to all of a sudden compete with Georgia for recruits. But you're going to see the Michigans, the Ohio States, you're going to see Penn States, Wisconsins, Nebraskas maybe go into Georgia a little bit more because of that connection with a fellow Big Ten school in Atlanta. And then you look at North Carolina, right? That's not so much recruiting, although it's a solid recruiting ground, but I see them, and they're a solid team on the football field. They provide more on the academics and research and basketball point of view, but they provide some good markets in Raleigh, North Carolina, and of course the Charlotte area as well. Why would getting schools like a Miami, like a Florida State, like a Georgia Tech, why would putting a dent in that part of the country be such a big deal for the Big Ten to make leaps forward to possibly surpass the SEC on the field? The SEC has had a stranglehold, man, on that region. And that region, the Southeast region, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, now Texas in the SEC, they have so much talent to pick from. And they have a complete stranglehold on that area as the nation's elite conference, being able to pick from the best, biggest, and baddest players in the Southeast area. I know the ACC is in that area. Hell, we're mentioning 2 ACC schools down there in Florida, one in Atlanta and one up in North Carolina. The ACC is already in that area, but when you talk about the SEC and the programs, the Floridas, the Bamas, the LSUs, the Georgias, now they're competing against these teams. Miami and Florida State were kind of down for a while. Maybe they're on the way back up. Clemson was kind of the only other school out there to be able to really compete against SEC schools in terms of that elite talent. The reason the SEC has maybe separated itself from the pack in terms of a conference, in terms of the talent level, is because Florida, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, all the areas that they have to pick from, it is, in terms of a large region, it is the ripest recruiting ground in the United States of America. And can you imagine if the Big Ten gets into there? We're really going to find out what could happen in the Southeast. We're going to find out that answer possibly with Los Angeles and the ripe recruiting ground. In the next few years, are your Ohio States, Michigans, Wisconsins, Michigan States, are teams going to be able to go into Southern California where maybe they didn't before? Are they going to be able to go into Southern California and pick that ripe recruiting ground? That's going to tell us a lot about maybe what could happen if the Big Ten gets into the Southeast. I believe the SEC knows if the Big Ten gets into the Southeast with all the revenue they're pulling in and all the exposure with this TV contract on Fox, on CBS, and NBC, if they're able to get into the Southeast, that's going to put chinks in the SEC armor. That's going to put dents in what the SEC is doing and the talent they bring in. Because now all of a sudden, you have brands like a Miami and a Florida State, and then you have all the other Big Ten brands that are going to be able to recruit more in the state of Florida, in the state of Georgia, and down in the southeast part of the country where that talent is so ripe. I mentioned it before, you got the ACC. But the ACC is a lot different from the Big Ten. For Big Ten schools now to call some of those markets their own and to be able to plant their flag into some of these recruiting markets would be huge. And that is why I believe the SEC is going to try to keep the Big Ten out. They're going to make preemptive moves. Miami, Florida State, Clemson. And I know Georgia Tech left the conference back in the day, but it would not surprise me to see the SEC add Georgia Tech just to keep the Big Ten out. Because that's where the SEC advantage lies, is the talent in that area of the country. Their ability to endlessly recruit the elite talent in that area of the country. If the Big Ten now has access into that area, this could blow up the whole thing. This could blow up the whole thing. The Big Ten could. I'm not saying they would, because I think although there'd be dents and although there'd be chinks in the armor, it would be very difficult to really overtake the SEC in that area just because the sheer amount of SEC teams in that area, and there would only be a few Big Ten teams in that area. But you'd start to see it over time, where the Big Ten is starting to pull in more higher level 4 stars in that area, more 5 stars in the areas like Florida, in the areas like Georgia. That's why I believe the SEC is going to try to keep the Big Ten out in terms of Southeast expansion. It is going to be a war down there, ladies and gentlemen, when this eventually opens up, and I am here for this battle. I can't wait to see it. What's realistic, though? What's realistic? I think all 4 of those schools realistically could be at it, and you also got to factor in Notre Dame when you talk about the ACC deal. I believe Florida State, Georgia Tech, North Carolina, and Notre Dame could be the 4 that come over from the ACC. Adding Notre Dame, as much as sometimes to put it nicely, don't like the Irish, I understand what they bring to the conference, and that's also got to be factored in as well. I believe it's going to be split up. I don't think all these schools are going to go to the Big Ten. I don't think all these schools are going to go to the SEC. But man, can you imagine if the Big Ten gets into Florida? Can you imagine if they get into Atlanta? That would be big-time news for Big Ten recruiting and bringing in more talent to these Big Ten programs. I want to hear what you guys think. Do you think if the Big Ten can get into the Southeast, can they surpass the SEC on the field, or will the SEC always have a stranglehold on that area no matter who comes in there and takes schools from that part of the country? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm Big Ten Ted. We will see you in the next one.